Boa tarde a todos e todas, sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas a nessa nossa sessão do segundo Congresso Internacional sobre Cruzadas e Ordens Militares. Hoje contamos com a presença do professor Jochen Schenk, e que ele gostaria de dizer que é uma honra e uma alegria muito grande tê-lo conosco, né, nesta tarde no Brasil e à noite, né, na Inglaterra. Professor Jochen, it's a great pleasure your presence with us in this session, in this Congress, and I would like to introduce you. Professor Jochen é professor da School of Humanities, University of Glasgow, tem se dedicado a pesquisas sobre história cultural e social dos Estados Cruzados, se interessando pela questão da coabitação cultural no Mediterrâneo Oriental durante os séculos XII e XIII. Seus projetos futuros buscam explorar as variedades de contato e de transmissão cultural entre diferentes grupos dentro do Oriente Latino e seu impacto para criar, manifestar e alterar fronteiras sociais. Dentre as suas publicações, podemos mencionar o livro Templar Families, Landholding Families and the Order of the Temple in France, 1120-3007, e o artigo Nomadic Violence in the First Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, in the Military Orders, publicado na Reading Medieval Studies. E, recentemente, os capítulos de livros publicados em 2021, Family Affairs, The Templar Trial, Proceeding as a Prosopographical Source, e The Military Orders in the Holy Lands. Professor Jochen, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and I shall give the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bruno, and just say as well for the kind invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be doing this. It's the nicest thing I'm doing today, and probably the more exciting thing I've been doing. I'm doing this week. It's one of the wonderful things. If anything good comes out of the current situation, that it's quite easy now to communicate between time zones, across time zones, and to be having these kinds of soirees and meetings. So I very much appreciate the invitation. I look forward to your questions after the talk. Now, the topic of my talk is slavery in the Crusader states, the status quaestionis. And it is very much a kind of a thinking paper, a topic that I have not been involved in researching for very long, and that I think requires a lot of work still, but that is a topic that's definitely worth exploring. And I've been on and off trying to do this for the past 2 years, coming up with ideas and some thoughts which I would like to present today. Now, historians of the Latin East are in general agreement that slavery was a feature of Latin Eastern society, although so far none of them has gone to great lengths explaining how important a feature it was or who exactly was affected by it. The consensus seems to be that the Franks in the Levant adopted slavery because everyone else in the region practiced it, and that the Italians in particular profited from it. If historians of the Crusades in the Latin East have little to say about slavery, historians of slavery have even less to say about the Latin East. The second volume of the Cambridge World History of Slavery, published this year and covering the period 500 to 1420 Common Era, has scarcely mentions the Crusader states at all. Although Geoffrey Paul, in his chapter on the Greater Mediterranean slave trade, acknowledges that Latin Europe's border zones with Islam, which presumably includes the Frankish states in the Levant, constituted an exception to the rule that between 1100 and 1348, Latin Europe had essentially become the first slave-less society in global history. What Finn Paul's chapter does deliver, however, and it does many great things, is a very erudite discussion of the interconnected and increasingly religious conscious nature of Mediterranean slave trade following the breakup of the Roman Empire, including the worthwhile reminder that in early medieval Francia, at least, the established Roman concept of slavery, which still serves as the model for many historians, has been replaced by a spectrum of unfreedom. An observation that finds support in Alice Rio's 2017 monograph, Slavery After Rome, 500 to 1100, where it is likewise argued that slavery in early medieval Latin Europe had become much more diversified than the inherited terminology suggests. And this is something to which I intend to come back later in my talk. There are, of course, good reasons why so far little work has been done on the subject of slavery in the Latin Levant, the most pressing one being the scarcity of sources. Studies of the medieval slave trade, mainly conducted out of Genoa, Venice, Pisa, or Marseille, the main Latin maritime powers involved in trade in the Eastern Mediterranean during the period of the Holy Land Crusades, tend to focus on the period from the late 13th century onwards, when notary records become sufficiently abundant for general conclusions about the volume, value, and extent of trade to be drawn. On the Islamic side, the focus usually falls on the Mamluk period, for which, again, the sources are more abundant and illuminating than for any preceding period. Hannah Barker's excellent recent monograph on the Mediterranean trade in Black Sea slaves between 1260 and 1500 is a case in point. In what follows, I intend to go through some of the evidence supporting this existence of slavery in the Latin East, before asking the question where the slaves came from and how slavery, in its practical application, was distinct from captivity. The existence of slaves in the Latin East is amply testified in the Latin documentary and narrative sources. The terminology used to identify slaves varies. The term most frequently used is esclavus or esclava, although in some cases a simple ethnic denominator preceded by a possessive pronoun like meos Saracenos was deemed sufficient to indicate a slave-master relationship. And sometimes mancipius or mancipia, or the Old Latin servus, or the French equivalent serf, was used. The last two terms are the most ambiguous to deal with. Servus, in classical Latin means slave, but by the 12th century it also referred to a whole range of unfree conditions. The term sclavus, on the other hand, was unambiguous in its meaning. Early legal references to the existence of slavery as an institution in the Kingdom of Jerusalem come in the form of a set of conciliar canons issued at Nablus in 1120, which outlined the punishments for illicit sexual relationships between Latin men and female Saracen slaves. Dating roughly 100 years later, the Assises de la Cour des Bourgeois provide a fuller account of slavery in a non-noble Frankish context by covering, among other topics, the inheritance rights of free slaves, the relationship of freed slaves to their former masters, the legal status of slaves, the treatment of runaway or criminal slaves, different pathways to emancipation of slaves, and the problem of debt slavery, whereby Christians were selling themselves on their own volition via middlemen as Saracens, por Saracen, into slavery. Slavery receives far less attention in the other 13th century law treatises associated with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and none of all in the Assises of Antioch, which has led Andrew Buck to suggest that perhaps in this principality, slavery simply wasn't practiced very much. As research by Joshua Proer, Marwan Nader, and most recently Adam Bishop has demonstrated, the Assises of the Cour de la Bourgeois draw heavily on Roman law, especially the Low Code, a Provençal law code and the 3rd century Lex Aquilia, from which the authors of the Assizes seem to have copied freely and often verbatim. It is where we find the text of the Assizes deviating from the model text that things become particularly interesting, as Adam Bishop could demonstrate. As he has pointed out, Assize 264 deals with slaves who are beaten or killed by someone other than their owner. The ruling itself is an almost direct copy of the corresponding law in the Lex Aquilia, apart from the fact that whereas the Lex Aquilia stipulates that the compensation for the slave would be calculated only for the previous year, the Jerusalem Assize identifies the slave as a Muslim and rules that compensation would be calculated according to the entire length of the slave's service. That in the Assizes of the Cour de la Bourgeois, slaves were by default equated with Muslims is interesting, although perhaps not very surprising given the circumstances, so I won't dwell on it here. What this variation also indicates, as again already pointed out by Bishop, is that the turnover rate for slaves in Jerusalem seems to have been a lot quicker than it had been in the 2nd century BC, the time of the Lex Aquilia, which is why compensation prices for injured or murdered slaves in the Kingdom of Jerusalem needed to be calculated on the basis of their entire period of service rather than on a yearly basis. This observation merits further consideration. 4 possible explanations come to mind why masters in the Kingdom of Jerusalem may have had a hard time holding on to their slaves for long. The first possible explanation is a high mortality rate amongst the slave population, for which we have no evidence. The second is a high conversion rate to Christianity among slaves, since the customary law of the Frankish kingdom bestowed free status on a slave who decided to convert to Christianity. The third possible explanation is a high abscondment rate, meaning slaves running away. And the fourth, a high buyout rate, meaning that ransom payments for slaves were quick in forthcoming. Now, I'm not aware of any evidence in support of a high mortality rate among Latin East's slave population. But we do have evidence contained in the letters of Jacques de Vitry and in a handful of papal decrees directed at the military orders and Latin clergy in the Levant that slaves did seek conversion and requested baptism. The same evidence also shows that Frankish slave owners, chief among them the military orders, resisted those requests and remained strong in their opposition to slave conversion, even in the face of papal disapproval. Ultimately, the Pope relented, and it was agreed that slaves who wished to be baptized should promise, I quote, to remain in the state of the former serfdom. This weakens the case for conversion as a main cause for a quick turnover of slaves somewhat, even if there is reason to believe that the increasing involvement of the mendicant orders in the Latin East from the 1230s onwards did help to boost the number of conversions. Explanations 3 and 4 look to me the most promising. The laws of the Kingdom of Jerusalem deal with the problem of runaway slaves at some length, which suggests that it occurred quite frequently. Whether or not slaves in the Latin states absconded at a higher rate than in other slave-owning societies is impossible to establish. But if they did, then one underlying reason might have been that most slaves had been procured locally or regionally, and therefore had a home or community to run back to. As historians of slavery in the early modern period have been quick to point out, local procurement of slaves for personal use would have been unusual, as slaves with social ties and roots in the locality of their serfdom were considered a potential security and prone to running away. In order to alienate them from their surroundings, it was therefore always considered safer to import slaves from elsewhere, the further the better. The idea that in the Latin East, slaves frequently ran away because they were sourced locally and therefore had social ties in the region sits well with the final explanation that ransom payments for slaves were quick in forthcoming. It too rests on the assumption that connections between slaves and their home communities had not been severed by distance, and that families of slaves had knowledge of the customs regulating ransom payments and access to the agents who arranged and facilitated these payments. The evidence for local procurement of slaves, as opposed to import from afar, is in fact very strong. The used source for slaves in the Latin East were captives taken in battle and during raiding campaigns. It was usually after a victory or return from a raid that captured prisoners were divided between the successful fighters. Captives who were not expected to fetch a ransom were distributed as booty and often sold as slaves at the earliest convenience. Case in point is a charter issued by King Amaric in Jerusalem in 1164, in which he promised the leper hospital of St. Lazarus one slave out of his share of the war booty of any military campaign or raid in which he was present or his banner displayed in his absence, and that gained him more than 10 slaves in total, provided the slave was not a knight. Where numbers of captives made during a military campaign or raid are cited in the sources, they are usually in the hundreds. For example, the Battle of Sarmin in 1115 is said to have produced 500 captives. A raiding party led by Geoffrey of Zergin in 1255 produced 400 slaves. And a combined attack by Hospitaller and Templar forces on La June in the winter of 1264 produced another 300. As one 13th century chronicler wrote, describing Geoffrey of Zergin's raid into the hinterland of Gaza and Ascalon in 1255, and I quote, "They swept through the villages and collected men, women, and animals, large and small." Occasionally, the numbers of captives even reached the thousands, as was the case, for example, after the Fatimid navy ran aground on the Syrian coastline in 1105, resulting in the capture of 2,000 soldiers and seamen. But for the most part, the sources are silent on the numbers, merely employing the same old trope that captives were taken and slaves obtained. The sieges of Caesarea and Serjud in 1111, Beirut and Tripoli in 1110, Atharib in 1111, Azaz in 1118-19, Bilbais in 1168, and Damietta in 1220, to name just a few, all are said to have ended with the enslavement of parts of the population. Walter the Chancellor and Gregory Bar Hebreus both noted the flood of slaves and prisoners entering Antioch after Roger of Salerno's victory over the Seljuk Turkish army of Burzuk bin Burzuk of Hamadan at Sarmin on the 14th of September 1150. And the Templars' three-day sack of Nablus in October 1242 likewise resulted in the transport of many of the town's surviving women and children to the slave markets of Acre. Imad ad-Din, for one, estimated the number of Muslims freed from Frankish captivity during Saladin's 1187-88 campaign to have been 20,000 or more, which gives us some idea of the scale and intensity of Frankish raiding activity in Muslim territory during the second half of the 12th century. Now, it seems expedient at this point to say something about the distinction between slave and captive. Not, however, without first acknowledging the large conceptual overlap between the two. Very crudely put, a slave was considered an economic asset, a captive a monetary one. The monetary value of a captive was his or her ransom price. Captives could be traded, but the expectation was always that eventually they would be bought back by their family or community for a price that guaranteed a good return on investment. In order to achieve that goal, a captive had to be kept alive and reasonably healthy. The value of a slave was his or her labor force, and the expected return on investment was the amount of work they were deemed capable of producing. The easy confusion between the two concepts is rooted in the fact that slaves usually were captives first, and that even after they had been sold and bought, they could be ransomed at the right price. The bottom line being that in the case of a slave, a ransom was not part of the buyer's initial financial calculation and therefore not expected. But even a crude distinction like this not always holds up to scrutiny. Take, for example, the case of the slave Kotoble, brought to light by Hans Meyer in his Urkunden des Lateinischen Königreichs von Jerusalem. It draws on two charters issued in Tyre in 1192, which record the sale by the Venetian merchant Giannone Stagnario of his share in a fourth of a Saracen slave named Kotoble to three other Venetian merchants, Domenico Contarini, Andrea de Molin, and Stefan da Fano, for 178 Saracen bezants. Giannone Stagnario, the merchant who sold his share, had been one of Conrad of Montferrand's creditors and had received his share in the slave from Henry of Champagne, who, after Conrad's death, evidently had felt obliged at least to try to settle his predecessor's debts. Clearly, the value of Kotoble, whom the charters identify as esclavos, was purely financial. It certainly was highly unusual for a slave to have multiple shareholders. Kotoble must have been a very valuable slave indeed, and the reason for holding a share in him must have been the expectation that despite his status as slave, he would fetch a very tidy ransom. The boundaries between captive and slave were further blurred by the fact that prisoners were routinely used for hard labor tasks and worked alongside slaves on the Franks' many construction sites. Workmen were always in short supply in the Latin East, and captives, like slaves, were an indispensable source of cheap labor. Traveling through the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1184, Ibn Jubayr encountered Muslim prisoners walking in shackles and put to painful labor like slaves. That's his words. In particular, the military orders, who during the late 12th and 13th century embarked on a number of spectacular building projects, used both captives and slaves, and the sources call them captivi et esclavi, in abundance. We know that the Templars used hundreds of captives for the construction of Châtelet at Jacob's Ford in 1178, and according to a Muslim source, Ibn al-Farad, there were 1,000 Muslim captives working on the construction of Castle Safed in the 1240s, whose peacetime garrison, as we know from the account of Benedict of Alliance, also included 400 slaves. In fact, ready access to cheap labor and experienced workmen was so important to the Templars and Hospitators that in 1263 they blocked Sultan Baybar's offer of a slave exchange with the King of Jerusalem at a rate of 1 Christian for 2 Muslim slaves, on the grounds that their Muslim slaves included many skilled craftsmen who were simply too valuable to be traded. Most likely, captives who failed to attract a worthwhile ransom but were physically in good condition eventually transitioned into the status of slave. The fate of those who were sold into slavery is seldom known to us. Many of the men were put to work on construction sites, as we have seen, or, and I guess this would apply to some women and children as well, as agricultural or viticultural labor. Visiting Cyprus in the 1330s, the German priest and traveler Ludolf von Sutheim expressed his admiration for the wines produced by the hospitals' vineyards at Engaddi, which once belonged to the Templars, who, it was still remembered, employed, I quote, 100 slaves, that is, Saracen prisoners, who had no duties or work imposed upon them save dressing and tending the vineyard. Occasionally, references to individual slaves show up in narrative and documentary sources. To give one very well-known and often cited example, Usama ibn Munkith relates the story of a former Crusade veteran living in Antioch who was in possession of a female Egyptian cook, and the general assumption is that she was a slave. Brian Goldman, in his truly excellent dissertation on Arabic-speaking Jews in Crusader Syria, draws attention to a query found among the Genesee documents and dated to 1220s. Addressed to Avraham Maimonides, the head of the Jewish community in Egypt, it concerned the ransoming of Egyptian Jewish women who, at an undisclosed time in the past, but seemingly not very long ago, and presumably during the Fifth Crusade, I quote, had been captured, sent to Acre, and sold as slaves. The literal translation from the Judeo-Arabic is that in Acre, these women were acquired as the property of men, which suggests that they were bought and employed as concubines, a common fate for female captives. The Genesee letter is interesting for many reasons, not least because it demonstrates how readily communities sprang into action to try to redeem captured and enslaved co-religionists. Other examples exist. In 2013, for instance, Jean-Michel Mouton, Janine Sourdel-Tomine, and Dominique Sourdel published 2 13th century Arabic letters in which are described similar attempts by Muslim individuals to have family members ransomed from Frankish captivity with the help of powerful intermediaries. The Genesee request cited by Goldman is also interesting, however, because it serves as a reminder that although most slaves in the Crusader states would have been Muslim, not all of them were. We know from other Genesee finds that after the conquest of Jerusalem, some captured survivors of the city's Jewish community had been sent to Acre and Italy to be sold as slaves there. And when in 1168 a Crusader army under King Amalric ransacked the city of Bilbais on the Nile Delta and took many Jewish captives, attempts to ransom them were organized by Maimonides, who was connected to important leaders in the Latin East, whom he instructed to act as intermediaries on his behalf. And 50-odd years later, dealing with the fallout of another Frankish invasion into Egypt, his son Avraham Maimonides faced a similar challenge, as has been mentioned. Now, the point I'm trying to make, admittedly in a rather roundabout way, is that there are good reasons to think of slavery in the Crusader states as a temporary rather than a static condition for those who had to endure it. The majority of slaves in the Latin kingdom were not aliens in the same way that those found in Italy or southern France were, or in the way slaves in the Roman Empire had been, who had to be imported from distant places. The ties of the men, women, and children captured during Crusader raids or campaigns to families and local communities had not been severed by distance, and efforts to secure their liberty through ransom continued even after their enslavement. The difference between slavery and captivity is very much in the eye of the beholder, and many so-called slaves may have considered themselves captives, and so did their relatives. And of course, the fluctuating fortunes of the Crusader states and Frankish society cannot have helped the establishment of long relationships between slaves and their owners either. It can be safely assumed that most slaves abandoned their Frankish masters as soon as the political situation rendered it opportune to do so, as was the case in 1187 and 1188, and on many occasions throughout the second half of the 13th century. And finally, in the politically volatile climate of the Latin East, which saw the forced displacement, imprisonment, and enslavement of huge numbers of people on both sides of the religious divide, slaves and captives became crucial diplomatic collateral. Thus, in 1250, while he was in Acre, King Louis IX organized the release of 300 Muslim slaves to be returned to Egypt in exchange for 90 enslaved Christian knights and 2,200 men and women. Building on that first success, he then, in the words of his chronicler, paid out large sums of money to buy Saracen captives from their Christian owners in order to send them to the Egyptian rulers so that they should send in return the remaining Christian captives back to him. And 13 years later, Sultan Baybars offered another exchange of slaves, but this time the idea was vetoed by the military orders, as I mentioned earlier. Having made my argument why slavery was a feature of the Latin East, but is best conceived as a temporary rather than a permanent status, I want to make a final point. I believe that chronology matters a great deal when we think about slavery in the Latin East. If slaves were a product of Crusade expansion, then the 13th century, despite the documented raids by the military orders and individual nobles like Geoffrey of Zergin, would have produced fewer of them than the 12th, causing potentially a shortage in the labor force at a time when building activity was at a high. So although I have the impression that the domestic market for slaves in the Latin East was pretty much self-sufficient in the 12th century, I'm not so sure that this would still have been the case in the 13th century. What we do see in the 13th century is a more open involvement of the Italians in the slave trade generally and the slave markets of Acre specifically. As the research, especially of David Jacobi, I think has shown quite clearly. In the early 1240s, the Venetian bailey in Acre, Marsilio Sorzi, complained that the Venetians were taxed in Acre for the sale of slaves, despite being entitled to total tax exemption according to their privileges. The origin of at least some of these slaves is revealed in a later letter dating from 1246, in which Pope Innocent IV harshly condemned Genoese peasant and Venetian merchants from exporting slaves from the Black Sea and selling them to the Muslims. The slaves transited through Acre on their way to Egypt, which was in constant need of male slaves for its military. Following the Byzantine recovery of Constantinople in 1261, the Genoese emerged as the leading actors in the slave trade between the Black Sea and Egypt, using again Frankish ports, in this case Tyre rather than Acre, from where they had been evicted in 1258 as trading spots along the way. This activity and the associated tariffs levied by the port authorities suggest a certain amount of important trade in slaves by the mid and late 13th century. Whether the Italians at any point exported Muslim slaves from the Latin East to Europe in the same way as Catalan traders did from Spain and the Genoese and Venetians later did from the Black Sea is much more difficult to ascertain. The existing documentation for Italian overseas trade is too sporadic for the 12th and early 13th century to allow me to formulate any sort of authoritative conclusion, and it might become the topic of another paper. In summary, slavery in the Latin East existed in the sense that language of slavery was widely used to describe the status of men, women, and children laboring for Frankish masters under servile conditions. But the language disguises what is, in fact, to recycle Jeff Paul's phrase mentioned at the beginning of this paper, a spectrum of unfreedom, with no clear line being drawn between captives and slaves in the old Roman sense. Slavedom, it seems, was a temporary status, at least for those poor souls who had been captured during raids and remained on the radar of their relatives and communities. Whether the Crusader states ever became an export market for slaves remains doubtful. Unlike the Iberian Peninsula, Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, and of course the Black Sea region, the Latin Levantine states very rarely feature among the places of origin of slaves recorded in the notarial records of Venice, Genoa, Pisa, or Marseille. At least not as far as I'm aware. And where Acre, Tyre, and Antioch are mentioned in the sources as places of slave trading activity, they usually do so as transit points for merchants trafficking humans from north, the Black Sea regions, to the south, to Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jochen, for the great conference. It's very interesting, the situation of the slaves and captives in the Latin West. We have some questions. The first one is, were there people or institutions responsible for the rescue of captives?
Well, yes, there were, and it's the whole business of freeing captives and providing ransom for captives becomes institutionalized in the 13th century. So you have on the Latin side the Trinitarian order, which is established for the purpose of ransoming captives and becomes quite active in the Latin East. On the Muslim side, it's something we find in the sources even earlier, where the ransoming of captives / slaves is seen as a religious duty, that communal efforts are being put into place to ransom people. We know from, is it Ibn Jubayr or I think it's Ibn Jubayr who mentions the activity of Syrian merchants, I think it's Syrian merchants, in ransoming captives from the Maghrebi countries. So prisoners from Northern Africa who have ended up in prisons in the Latin East. So they must have come over either as merchants or as fighters at one point, and because they did not have any ties to the localities, they have no community to take care of them. So it became a duty that these merchants took upon them, who kind of ransomed them. And he mentions them. I think it's Ibn Jubayr who talks about them quite specifically, how active they are in this field. So we see this being a more communal effort on the Muslim side, and we have, as the examples I mentioned with Maimonides, who's trying to get the Jewish communities activated to ransom captives, and you have on the Latin side that it becomes a more institutionalized effort in the 13th century. Not so much, it seems, in the early years of the Crusader states. There's kind of a big argument that ransoming prisoners actually doesn't become a real feature for the Latins until later in the game, and it's something they kind of seem to have picked up from their Muslim counterparts, and then it becomes kind of a back and forth where you have agreements between Muslim and Christian leaders, Latin leaders, about exchanging Muslim prisoners and so on. So it's a lot more individualistic on the Latin sides until in the 12th century at least.
Thank you, Professor Jochen. On a question, the Mamluk system, great reference about the use of the slaves in the Islamic world. In the Islamic world, the slaves develop another activities, domestic activities. What kind of activities the slaves develop in the Islamic world?
That's a broad question. Well, the Mamluks are a prime example of kind of the military career, that slaves could have, and they were obviously imported for exactly that reasons. So you have a very healthy trade in slaves between the Black Sea, from the Black Sea regions into into Egypt, facilitated by the Genoese, and then the Golden Horde, the Mongols, have their part to play as well in funneling young men into Egypt to be trained as soldiers, as Mamluks. That is certainly one big field of activity, but very specific one at the same time. Other than that, you have the employment as in domestic slaves, which ranges from concubines, but also to just skilled labor force, and well, everything to do with the household. So it's really everything in between that you find. The authority on this right now is Hannah Barker's book. Really, I would suggest on the Black Sea trade, slave trade in the later Middle Ages. And she gives some really good examples. Also, how that whole trade is being conducted and how sophisticated a market it actually becomes on the Muslim side, how slaves are being selected, what the criteria are that buyers are looking for, how you can return a slave, and so on. So there are wonderful examples of the kind of activities in which they're involved, which really are a broad range of household activities.
Yes, thank you, Professor Jochen. A last question. In the Eastern Mediterranean, which the main centers for the sale of slaves?
Yeah, that is a really good question, because it's one that that really occupies me a lot. So I guess if you look at Eastern Mediterranean in the general sense, and if you focus just for now on my period, the kind of the Crusader period, it's well, definitely you have Alexandria, you have Cairo, the big markets, you have Damascus, and so on. If we focus on the Latin East, the Crusader states, and this is a really perplexing thing, historians talk about the slave markets in Acre, the slave markets in Tyre, the slave markets in Antioch. And sometimes the sources mention that slaves are being transported to Acre, which is quite obvious. This is where the ships come in, and then they're kind of being sold on. They don't mention slave markets. The existence of a market, it doesn't show up. And I think that, well, interesting enough, it's also not something that Western travelers, people who come to the Holy Land from Germany or wherever, think of John of Würzburg and so on, they come from societies where there are no slaves. So you would think that they would comment on the fact that there are slave markets somewhere else, because it is actually quite unusual for Westerners to see that they don't. When they go to Jerusalem, when they go to Acre, when they go to other places, they talk about all sorts of markets, but not slave markets. Slave markets don't come up. Now, I think there's an explanation for it. On the one hand, I think it's not a specialized trade, and that's something that, again, Hannah Barker makes quite clear, that the traders who kind of trade in humans are the ones who also trade in animals, and they have horse traders and so on. For them, humans are just another kind of cargo. Very often, you find when it comes to kind of taxes and all these kind of economic concerns, financial issues, you often find slaves mentioned alongside horses or animals. So the assumption is they are being just sold in the same places where these animals were being sold. It also seems the case that actually the slave trade on the Western side is a lot more private than you would find it on the Muslim side, where you have slave markets or quarters where slaves are being sold, and in the West Latin sense, it's more kind of a private affair, where someone would just go to someone else's place and just buys a slave, and there's kind of assortment of produce. So it's not that much in the open, but it's one of these which really puzzled me. So everyone's talking about slaves, but every time I go through sources, they just know the markets aren't there. They don't show up. There is no slave market as such that's being mentioned, and people don't comment on it at all.
Yes, thank you, Professor Jochen. We haven't another questions. I would like another time. Thank you for your presence. It's a great day for us. I admire you very much because of your article, of your book. So thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure, and I hope we can meet in person sometime in the future. It would be my honor.
Thank you, professor Jochen. Obrigado a todos e todas pela presença. Não temos mais nenhuma questão e nos vemos amanhã. Nos encontramos para o nosso último dia. Se cuidem e fiquem bem. Tchau. See you.
Bye-bye.